So after nearly falling into financial collapse and disappearing as so many other Formula 1 teams have done in years gone past, Force India have been saved and will continue to race, hopefully for many years to come. But the way in which they were bought out and allowed to continue racing has not been as what normally happens when teams are bought out and become other teams, as with, for example, Brawn becoming Mercedes or Jaguar becoming Red Bull Racing. There's been a lot of squabbling and confusion over whether Force India is a new entry or not, what their name is, why they've been stripped of all their points, and if they are technically a brand new team, whether they deserve a fresh batch of engines or not. It's all been unnecessarily confusing to most F1 fans, so I'm going to break it down for you once and for all. Let's go back to the beginning. Force India as a racing team began life in 2008 after Vijay Mallya and Michel Mole bought the Spiker F1 team. That team in particular had been through a wonky patch, with Spiker having been bought from Midland F1 the year before, and Midland F1 having bought the team the year before that from Jordan Grand Prix. So Jordan became Midland, became Spiker, became Force India, but at no point were any of these teams considered a new entry by the FIA. That's because by buying the team as a whole entity, the new owners also took hold of the team entry, which is basically the official legal bit that lets the FIA recognise them as an existing F1 team. So while the team changed names and owners, as far as the FIA were concerned, this was the same team from year to year. And I think we can agree with that. The staff, the buildings, the infrastructure of the team was all the same, the cars just became a different colour and there was a new logo over the garages. Now at the end of 2011, a company called Sahara bought into the team. This meant that Sahara owned 42.5% of the team, Vijay Mallya owned 42.5% of the team, and Michel Mole owned the other 15%. All well and good, quite a few of the teams have shared ownership. Now unfortunately, the owners of the team will run into what we'll lightly describe as a spot of money trouble. In 2012, Kingfisher Airlines, a company owned by Mallya, folded after succumbing to crippling debts. Now 17 Indian banks were looking to collect upwards of £1 billion loaned to Mallya, which, if my sums are correct, is quite a bit of money. Meanwhile at Sahara in 2014 their director was imprisoned on financial misconduct, and Sahara itself began drowning in debt and was looking to sell off some of its assets to get itself back on track. Now those assets included its share in the Force India team. So Force India have been struggling financially for quite a while. In 2015 there were reports that it was inches from financial collapse and they were desperately looking to sell the team on. It's incredible just how well the team have done considering what's been happening behind the scenes. The proverbial swan, graceful above water with its feet kicking like billy-o below the surface. So let's flash forward to 2018. It was beginning to look very dire for the team, with 85% of its shareholders having some serious debt issues to deal with, and now the team itself was racking up its own debts to its employees and suppliers. Among them were Mercedes and Sergio Perez, who were owed reportedly £11 and £3 million respectively. Now this is where Perez and Mercedes pushed the team into administration. Now let's explain what that means. So when you're in a heap of debt as an organisation, there are really a couple of last-ditch scenarios, and one is liquidation or folding, collapsing, very dramatic. Now liquidation basically means you start selling off all of your assets to make as much money as possible to pay the people you owe money to. The company ceases to exist as a legal entity and your sole responsibility is essentially to sell off the company for parts to satisfy the people chasing for the money owed. Now by assets I mean everything the company owns, so that's their land, their buildings, their equipment, their contracts, their software, their vehicles, any intellectual property like whatever you've developed for next year's car, for example. Now all of this can be sold off piece by piece or perhaps en masse. When a company is liquidated, there's always a chance that someone will buy up most or all of your assets and keep the company going almost as it was. Now they'd have to start a new company as the old one was written off, but if you've got all the same stuff to keep the company going, you can do it. Now of course the liquidation scenario is a maximum risk to your staff and to your team. If Force India had liquidated, there'd be no obligation for anyone to keep the team going or for any of the staff to remain employed. Nothing. There is maximum risk to the 400 plus employees of becoming unemployed. And Force India was reaching the point where they'd be forced to fold by the people Mallya and Sahara owed money to. At some point you do have to pay up. So for example, if Vijay Mallya owed a bunch of banks a lot of money, they could very well say, look, you own an F1 team, let's liquidate that and get some of our money there. Now it's important to note that Mallya and Sahara's debts are different to Force India's. These three entities all owe money individually, but as Mallya and Sahara own Force India, that's the kind of thing debt collectors will see as worth coming for. Kind of like how debt collectors will take your TV if you're a normal person owing money and not a billionaire. So to stop the team collapsing into liquidation, instead Perez, Mercedes and a bunch of people forced Force India into administration, which is a very different scenario. Administration basically puts the pause button on everything. They get a grace period, normally a year, in which to put together a rescue plan and figure everything out. They can't be hunted for their debts, legal action against them is minimised, and the company is basically put into a little bit of a bubble. Now when in administration, whatever plan you come up with must be in the interest of the people you owe money to, so the administrators will be coming up with a plan to get those debts paid off. That's the deal. So what happens during this period is admins are gathering information on the team, figuring out what's worth what, whether a buyer can be found, whether bits of the team can be sold off, and yes, if at the end of the day, folding the company is the best thing to do. So when Perez says he thought administration was the only way to secure people's jobs, he was right. Administration gave Force India a stay of relief against the demands of the heavy debts of its owners. So that's administration. Now, while in administration, Lawrence Stroll and a team of investors worked to buy the whole of Force India over the summer break, so they could turn up in Belgium with a team and carry on as if nothing happened. That would be the dream, right? But in actuality, it became a little bit more complicated. What would normally happen is that Stroll's team would buy all of the shares from the company from Malia, Sahara, and probably Mole, so the whole of Force India, the organisation, was now under Stroll & Co.'s ownership. Now, this would include the important team entry that allowed FIA to recognise the team as a continuing entrant in the World Championship. Now, had there been a bit more time, I'm sure Stroll would have managed to negotiate this, but the administrator was strict about the deal being wrapped up in just a couple of weeks. The banks and creditors were getting very twitchy and not willing to give up the company as a whole. So, in the interest of getting everything done, instead of buying Force India, the company, Stroll just basically bought up everything Force India had. All the assets needed to keep the team going, racing and carrying on as normal, even the debt Force India owed that he promised to pay off. Everything except the team entry itself. So, now Stroll had an F1 team, but it wasn't recognised as an entry into the F1 Championship. Now, you might think it's easy enough for the FIA to say, look, we can tell you're the same team, everyone knows you're the same team, let's just pretend nothing happened and go racing as normal. But the FIA has to do things by the book, because legally other teams or drivers or anyone could legitimately challenge the new Force India's rights to race, to collect points, to collect prize money, and if there was a crash, people could get sued for causing a crash while not legitimately being allowed to even be on the tracks. It's a minefield. So some deals were done. Firstly, Stroll had to convince the FIA that the debts were all sorted, the jobs at Force India were secure, and the team wasn't going to be wobbling along financially insecure. It needed to be stable on its own right. The FIA did not want a continuing tale of a struggling team on the brink of collapse. Happy that that was all sorted, the FIA then excluded the old Force India from the championship. It had to, because the old Sahara Force India could no longer compete, as it had no team, no cars, no drivers, it didn't have the means to go racing. These things were all owned by the new company. Old Force India's points were wiped from the record, as on paper Sahara Force India's time in F1 was over. And this act brought to a close the official F1 entry of the team started as Belgian Grand Prix in 1991. Next, the FIA entered the new Force India into the championship as a brand new entry using their rarely used late entry form. The team would obviously have no points, as far as the books were concerned, it had never raced before. So this is when you ask, well, if it's a new team, then why is it still called Force India? Well, here's the interesting thing about the official name of a Formula 1 team. It has to include the chassis name. Now, the chassis is basically the main body of the car as approved by the FIA. It's the bit you stick the wheels on and put the engine inside. Let's have a look at Toro Rosso as an example. Now, Toro Rosso's official entry name for 2018 is Red Bull Toro Rosso Honda. Toro Rosso is the official chassis name, which has to be included in the team name, and you can see in this list of the 2018 entries which parts of the team name are the chassis names. So the Sahara Force India Formula 1 team entered chassis under the name Force India, and these chassis were approved and registered to compete by the FIA. Now, as these are the same chassis that are now being used by Racing Point, the full entry name had to include Force India, and that's why Racing Point Force India is the name on the entry list. Now, next year the name Force India will disappear. It's unclear what the team will be called. It's unlikely that Racing Point will be the official name. That was just a placeholder name, as Racing Point UK was the organisation put together by Stroll & Co to grab Force India. Now, in case there's any confusion at this point, the Force India drivers do of course keep their points. As a driver, you can move from team to team throughout a season, collecting points as you go. Now, as a new team, you might think Force India would get a fresh allocation of power units for the rest of the season. Wrong! The power unit usage continues as left off from Force India. Now, as it turns out, there's nothing in the rulebook that covers any of this. This is a rare situation, so the FIA had to decide what to do in terms of fairness, and as the team's drivers had already accumulated a bunch of points in those chassis, they thought it was only fair that they not be handed the advantage of having a fresh supply of engines to continue their campaign. Okay, so what about the prize money then? Will Racing Point Force India be able to collect on old Force India's prize money? And the answer is yes, but it did take the agreement of all the other teams. We should be thankful this wasn't blocked by the other teams trying to gain an advantage. When teams fold, their prize money is normally divided among the remaining teams. The sticking point, however, which is yet to be fully resolved, is what prize money they are entitled to going forwards. See, normally a brand new team does not get any of the share of the commercial rights money in their first season of competition. That money only starts kicking in from season 2. Haas, who recently had to wait for their share of the pie, have been notably edgy about this whole situation. Again, this situation is a bit unprecedented, so we'll have to wait to see how it resolves. This whole situation has never been seen before, and it's actually something of a miracle that everyone pulled together to make sure that Force India, the team, could continue to compete in Formula 1. And though there have been some arguments behind the scenes, it's really a story of rivals and rulemakers alike trying to do what's fair for a decent, hard-working team. And Racing Point Force India immediately opening their account with 18 points in Belgium was truly the icing on the cake.